Welcome to Public Health America. I'm your host, Dr. William Latimer. It is a very special privilege and pleasure to have my guest with us today, Dr. David Contosta, Professor and Chair of History at the greatest private Catholic college in Pennsylvania, Chestnut Hill College. David, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Bill.
So, David, I know you've written quite a few books. In fact, I've got one right here. Suburban the City, Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia, 1850 to 1990. David, I've done some reading. This is just so unbelievably informative. You're a historian. You have looked closely at small communities in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. I know you're working on a book now. Tell us about your work.
Well, I'm working on a book now about the presidency and particularly how it is involved with democracy and the possibility of overthrowing democracy. I'm calling it Promise and Perils, the American Presidential Experiment.
That's great. Tell us about what is the primary premise and what is your research indicating to you at this stage of your writing that book?
Well, I begin by saying that most Americans have a kind of a civic faith that the Constitution created a model democracy that could never be compromised or overthrown. And in fact, they take pride in supporting democratic movements abroad and opposing autocracies. And yet, Americans nearly lost their democracy on January 6th, 2021. So one of the things I'm talking about is how presidents have had the capacity from the very beginning to abuse their power and threaten American democracy. And I go through a number of presidents. It's not a history of the entire presidency and of all presidents, but that's the thesis of it.
So let me ask you this. You say you go through some of the history. In addition to the events of January 6, 2021 and Trump's presidency, do you look at other presidencies as well and sort of abuse of power? And what are there signposts or key moments in U.S. history and Trump's presidency that you focus on?
Yes, I do. In fact, there's a duality within the book in which I compare various presidents. For example, one of the chapters is called Old Hickory and the Great Emancipator, and it's a contrast or a comparison between Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. And both of them used extraordinary power, but for different reasons. Andrew Jackson used his power to send 4,000 people to their deaths along the Trail of Tears. He used his power to destroy the Second Bank of the United States, which ushered in a terrible depression. And then we have Abraham Lincoln, who used extraordinary power to free 4 million people. Both of them were extremely powerful, the most powerful presidents of the 19th century. And another chapter is called Demigod and Dissenter. And the demigod is George Washington. Parson Weems wrote this famous book in which he compares Washington to Jupiter. And at the time of Washington's death, people saw him as a savior God had sent to win the revolution and to save American democracy. There were lithographs showing Washington going up into heaven. And if you've ever looked at the dome of the Capitol from the inside, looking up into it, there's the apotheosis of Washington. That means making him a godlike character. And he's sitting there with all these Greek gods and goddesses and Old Testament figures. Thomas Jefferson, among others, was horrified by that and was very concerned about turning presidents into semi-divine characters. There's a cult of personality that emerged around Washington, and that's another topic that I look at in the book and discuss why cults of personality have become stronger and stronger in the present day.
So let me ask you this. I mean, that's an excellent summary. It kind of, for me, it begs the question. So you've got George Washington and Abraham Lincoln on one hand, and if this is an oversimplification, I know you'll correct me. David, and you've got Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump on the other hand. But they're all what they have in common, if I understood you correctly, is that all four of those individuals exerted enormous presidential influence. But I think, and again, it depends on what side of the aisle you're on, but what I hear you suggesting is that in two instances it was done for great good, and for two of those instances not so much, or considerable not good. So is it truly a matter of the degree to which a president exercises their power in the United States, or is it what they exercise their power for? Is that a fair question?
It's partly what they exert their power for, and there are some interesting comparisons between Donald Trump and Andrew Jackson. In fact, when Donald Trump was running for president, he went down to the Hermitage, which is Andrew Jackson's plantation, where he had about 150 enslaved people throughout his life. And the reason he went down there is because both he and Andrew Jackson appealed to people who were angry, who felt that they were being disrespected, who felt that they were looked down on by educated people, by people on the East Coast, and so forth. And it's interesting that Donald Trump hung an oil portrait of Andrew Jackson beside his desk in the Oval Office. And it's hard to see that comparison in some ways because Trump comes from a wealthy family in Queens, and yet Trump felt as if he was disrespected. When he moved to Manhattan, people didn't give him the accord that he thought that he should have. And so he's an angry young man, and he continues to be angry. And Jackson's a very angry young man also, partly because he was orphaned very early on and kicked around and not really appreciated by his foster family. And one of the things I talk about elsewhere in the book are presidential characters and how they're formed. And we've had a number of presidents who have been angry and revengeful because of the way that they were brought up, including Richard Nixon. I talk about that.
Yep.
Deal.
So let's bring it to today. I mean, you make an excellent point about how Andrew Jackson, Donald Trump utilize similar strategies to mobilize folks that might have felt disenfranchised. And that resulted in tens of millions of people voting for Donald Trump twice. We're also talking about the use of power. I haven't yet heard you say that the way Abraham Lincoln and the way George Washington and the way that Andrew Jackson and the way that Donald Trump, that the extent of their power was different, rather how they used it. So what does history teach us today? What are the takeaways that we want to learn from these different administrations so that maybe we can try to do things better? Is that a fair question?
Well, I think that we need to have a better sense of what these people were like before they became president and how they developed. For example, the mainstream media knew a great deal about Donald Trump before he became president of the United States, and that didn't seem to resonate with the voters and with the American people. It was also known that Andrew Jackson fought a number of duels. He actually shot and killed a man in a duel. He was a real hater. He called people names. That's something else that he had in common with Donald Trump. And unfortunately, we don't look into people's backgrounds as well as we should. I think today there's a problem with the primary system in that almost anybody who can gather enough money can enter the primaries. And that happened, of course, in 2016. And this isn't going to be very popular, but I think the old convention system was a lot better. The Republican convention never would have nominated Donald Trump. And in the convention system, the delegates to the conventions knew these people, had often served in public office with them.
So forgive the naivete of this question. When did the convention system go out of effect? When did it stop being used?
It still exists. Primary elections started in the early 20th century on the local and state level because political parties were corrupt. But until the early 1970s, the presidential primaries were just beauty contest. That is, the primaries did not choose delegates, and this occurred in the late 60s because of concern about what happened in the Mississippi delegation not being seated and so forth. So the Democrats decided that the primaries would decide the delegates to the conventions, and then the Republicans followed suit. So since the early 1970s, it's been the presidential primaries which have selected the presidential candidates. And I think it's misfired and backfired in many cases.
So back to your earlier point of a few minutes ago. So if I hear you correctly, David, you're saying we need to look more closely at a person's background and their values, their behaviors, when making decisions like who we want to be our next president. If that is indeed correct, I mean, certainly sitting here, one thought that I have is, in the day of internet and Twitter and Instagram and so on, there is no shortage. I mean, there were plenty of examples of the way Donald Trump acted, the things he said that were very offensive, et cetera. But that didn't seem to matter, right? I mean, he got elected. So what is just knowing a person's background enough?
Well, it may not be. And of course, some people liked what Donald Trump was saying. They thought he was tough and he was going after the people that they hated as well. But I think, and I talk about this too, the celebrity presidency, people aren't really affected too much. They don't pay a lot of attention to people's backgrounds. And in the book, I talk about the manipulation of still photography and then moving pictures and then television and then social media. So people often vote on the basis of what they see and what's pervaded through imagery of one kind or another. And campaigns are very skillful in doing that. Social media is very problematic because of the algorithms. If you look on a certain site, then you're going to be fed that site again and again and again, and you're not going to see alternative points of view. Cable TV is also a culprit, it seems to me. If you go back to the time when there were just 3 networks, they didn't dare veer too much out of center because they were going to lose viewers and lose revenue. Now cable TV stations attract a lot of people by taking a very limited point of view. So it's very difficult to try to convey a sense of the truth if someone is watching a certain cable news program all the time, or depending on social media, a certain kind of social media.
So let me put you on the spot. I think this is a difficult question given the complexity, but you can certainly correct me. If I were to say to you, in terms of your book and the many lessons learned and things you're discussing, that there's a fair degree of complexity. If there were 3 things that you could do to improve either the electoral process or the role of the presidency in the United States today, what would those 3 things be?
I'd get rid of the Electoral College. I would make partisan gerrymandering illegal so that candidates can't choose their voters, although that's more important in the Congress as it is in the presidency. I would reform the Electoral Count Act. I would also try to strengthen the War Powers Act, I think of 1978. And one of the things I propose too is that social media be treated like any other kind of media. That is, they could be sued for libel like newspapers or television stations, which might stop them from telling the kinds of lies that they are telling now. So I think that might be an important reform.
Those sound like excellent suggestions to me. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Dr. David Contosta of Chestnut Hill College in Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, will tell us a little bit about his education and how his education set the stage for the exceptional career he has had and has. This is Public Health America. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Public Health America. I'm your host, Dr. William Latimer. So, David, we always open this part of the program with the exact same question, which is, tell us where you were born and about some of your formative experiences.
I was born in Lancaster, Ohio, which is about 30 miles southeast of Columbus, or 455 miles due west of Philadelphia, where I'm sitting here this morning. I just published a memoir with a first cousin recently about that, calling An American Childhood. And a lot of the experiences that I had are included there. I think I had a very good childhood. We were middle class people. We didn't live in any kind of poverty. But one of the things that Philip, my first cousin and co-author, emphasized was that, yes, we had a good life, but not everybody in town did. There was terrible racism visited on African Americans in town, and I can tell some stories about that. The African Americans lived in a section of town below the big houses where they tended to be domestic servants, and they were not allowed to use the municipal swimming pool until the day before they cleaned the water. I'd heard that story when I was growing up and didn't believe it, but I interviewed an elderly African American man many years later, and he confirmed that. And the African Americans also had a committee to discourage people from out of town, African Americans from out of town, from moving in, quote, causing trouble, unquote. There was one African American kid in my whole high school graduating class. It was a public high school out of about 350. We also talk in the book about the sexism, about the homophobia. It was not a very diverse community in any way. I don't remember any Asians there. I don't remember any Hispanic people there. I don't remember anybody who wasn't essentially white, and most were Protestants for that matter. There was a horrendous anti-Catholicism in this town where I was growing up.
So how aware were you as a child or an adolescent or a young man about the factors that you're just describing in terms of racism, the presence of racism, the lack of true diversity? Was that something that was, like, at what point did you become aware of those issues?
I heard adults use the N-word fairly frequently, not in my family, but others. And I thought it was wrong. My parents thought that was wrong. I had an uncle, in fact, who was very racist, said horrible things. I admired him a lot as a child, but then when I realized what he was saying and doing, it was very upsetting to me.
And in what way did that shape? I mean, you're a historian.
Yes.
Do you trace a line to those experiences and becoming aware of the, horrific aspect of racism in this country? Was that a motivation to become a historian?
It was, and of course I came of age and was in college in the 1960s during the whole counterculture, during the civil rights movement. I wouldn't say that I was heavily involved in it, but I was in some marches when I was on the college campus. And I've talked about that recently in the classroom because we ended the first semester by talking about Reconstruction and the hideous aspect of white nationalism in this country. I kind of burst forth and gave a kind of a sermon in the classroom saying that white nationalism was used to abuse Native Americans. It was used to abuse African Americans. It was used to abuse Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and so forth. And in fact, it was not just white Christian nationalism. It was often white Christian Protestant nationalism. There was a Protestant minister in my hometown who in 1960 gave a series of 6 sermons blasting Kennedy, saying that if he were elected president of the United States, the Pope would be running the country. And he had collected those and published them in a pamphlet. And I think I reacted against those kinds of things about my childhood.
Sure. Where did you do your undergrad, and tell us a little bit about, your experiences there and how the kinds of enormous challenges that our country was facing and still faces today, albeit in some similar and some different ways. But what was your undergraduate experience like as it pertained to these issues?
I went to Miami University of Ohio, and I was a political science major back then. And I had a number of professors who were fairly liberal, I guess I would say. And I remember them very well. And they challenged a lot of views that I had brought with me to college. And I think unless you begin to challenge some of your beliefs, some of your views when you're in college, you haven't really received a good college education. I guess I'll go back to one of the things people talked about in the hometown, and this is in the memoir that I wrote about my cousin. There were some poor people who lived in the hills south of town. The town was on a dividing line. It was on the 40th parallel, the very beginning of Appalachia on the one hand, and then there were these rolling fields and prosperous farmers on the other hand. And adults said that people down in the hills were poor because they were lazy. They didn't have a sense that geography might play a role in that. And so these kinds of views were challenged for me when I was in college. And I think that college should also make you look at yourself, know better who you are, know thyself, of course, is something that we all should take out of the college experience. I can tell you some other things about it if you like, but I'll let you ask another question, Bill.
Sure. So what were some of the key factors that contributed to having that inward looking at oneself and thinking, looking at things conceptually and understanding sociocultural factors that were affecting the way people thought, what people did. What was unique, or what happened at Miami University that allowed you to grow in that way?
Well, I just took a number of satisfying and exciting courses in political science, in sociology, in history, in literature. I think that the core curriculum, we didn't call it that, but the core curriculum just really opened my eyes, all kinds of things that I'd never thought about. It was a kind of a feast to me. I sometimes felt as if I were drunk on learning. Maybe that's an idiotic way of describing it. But I remember going to the library and into the stacks and sitting there on the floor and pulling out books and then talking with fellow students into the night, having bull sessions, as we called it, and arguing, not vociferously, but discussing what we had learned, what we had been reading. And so I think that's one of the most important things about college or university experience, is having those discussions with friends and fellow students.
That's great. So you're here with me at Chestnut Hill College in Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we have 50 to 51% Pell eligible students, low income students. We have roughly 50% students of color, 40 to 45% first generation college students. Tell me just about your philosophy of teaching and the importance to a liberal arts education to the underserved.
Well, when I was in college, we used to call it the liberating arts. And I think that they free us. There was a caption above one of the buildings on the archway. It's a quote from one of the Gospels: "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And I think that's what the liberating arts do if they work properly. They help you to get rid of the prejudices and aversions and ignorances maybe that you brought to bear when you went to college to begin with. And in teaching history here at Chestnut Hill College, my point about history is it's not about the past so much as it's about the present. It tells us how we got to where we are now, and it gives us some clues as to where we've been. And I've said again and again that not having a knowledge of history is like having amnesia. You don't know who you are because you don't know where you have been. So it's not just a past for its own sake. It's a tool for understanding ourselves as individuals and as a society and as a culture, and what we can do to repair things that need to be repaired.
That's wonderful and such a great way to say it. Also, we know Chestnut Hill is enlivened by and informed by and guided by the Sisters of St. Joseph, the congregation here in Philadelphia that founded the college in 1924. There are a number of St. Joseph that are still faculty members here and staff, and add a great deal to the daily life. How do you tie in the legacy and the mission of the college as it relates to the Sister St. Joseph to the function of the liberating arts?
Well, I was impressed by how learned and how dedicated the Sisters of St. Joseph were to the college and to the community. And I had an interesting experience very early on when I came here. I discovered that Sister Mary Helen had a Fulbright scholarship to France, as I did, just 3 years before I went there, and that we studied the same person there and knew some of the same people in the archives there. And we gave a talk then about it, I think in the second semester I was here, and then wrote a paper together. So I've had wonderful collaborations with the Sisters of St. Joseph. I've taught interdepartmental honors courses with them. I admire their dedication, lifetime of dedication to their work and to the college. They really care about the students. And I probably would say that I did not grow up as a Catholic, and I had never been around nuns before. And this was a wonderful thing for me. And I think coming to Philadelphia was a wonderful thing to me too, coming from this small town where there was very little in the way of ethnic or racial diversity. It really made me realize, I believed it, but it made me realize that there's only one human race, that we're all the same. We all love our children and our families and our friends, and we all should want everyone else to do well. And I talked about this crazy zero-sum game idea that if some people do better, other people are not. If we all do better, we all do better. And so it's been an enlightening experience for me here to know sisters and to know people from all over the country, really, at Chestnut Hill College.
A wonderful place to stop our program by highlighting the enormous service and focus on social justice and equality indebted to the Sisters of St. Joseph here at Chestnut Hill College, under the equally important and exceptional leadership and pedagogical expertise of people like Dr. David Contosta. I want to thank David for joining us today. I want to thank our viewers for tuning in. We'll see you next time at Public Health America. I'm your host, Dr. William Latimer. Until then, take care.